right, well, thank you everyone and welcome. My name is Sarah Padilla. I'm the Manager of Initiatives at Keecha Harris and Associates, or KHA, and I'm really happy to be with you here this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements. This session will be recorded and we would like you to, if possible, keep on your Zoom cameras so we can see you and get to know one another in this virtual setting. And you are welcome to make a comment or ask a question at any time during the session in the chat box, and we will be monitoring those. There will be some time for questions and answers at the end of the session. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Keecha Harris. Keecha is the director of the President's Forum on Racial Equity in Philanthropy, and she is the CEO of KHA. So welcome, Keecha.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time this morning and early afternoon for those of you on the East Coast for joining us today. It's good to see so many familiar faces and quite a few new faces in this virtual room, so we're looking forward to today's conversation. The President's Forum is one of 3 field-building initiatives led by KHA, and it's hosted in partnership with the Institute for Strategic and Equitable Development, in Partnership Consulting, and Alley Web Strategies. The goal of the President's Forum is to create a space where CEOs can candidly discuss racial equity, including some of the most difficult issues and trade-offs. We also try and create a space where people can think through these important issues with others facing the same or similar questions. Today's session is intended to provide a space for open and candid dialogue, just 1 month after what was certainly a historic 2020 presidential election in a time of ongoing challenges. It will build upon previous sessions of the President's Forum, and we are hoping to offer this space to you as foundation leaders and staff to connect with others during what has been and continues to be a time of importance and extreme challenges. I'm pleased to introduce you to and welcome our panelists. And so we'll start out with John. John Palfrey is president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, one of the nation's largest philanthropies, with assets of approximately $7 billion and offices in Chicago, Mexico City, New Delhi, and Abuja. John is a well-respected educator, author, legal scholar, and innovator with expertise in how new media is changing learning, education, and other institutions. Throughout his career, he has demonstrated a commitment to rigorous thinking, disruption, and creative solutions often made possible by technology, accessibility of information, and diversity and inclusion. John has extensive experience in social change spanning the education, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors. Maria del Socorro Pesqueira is the president of the Healthy Communities Foundation. She is an award-winning visionary leader and sought-after speaker addressing local, national, and hemispheric audiences on a wide variety of topics, including health disparities, immigration reform, women and family issues, violence prevention, and the future of philanthropy. Before joining the Healthy Communities Foundation, Maria served as president of Mujeres Latinas en Acción. Preceding her time at Mujeres, Maria led the National Museum of Mexican Arts Development and Marketing team. At an early age, and as the eldest daughter of Mexican immigrants, she became a translator, advocate, convener, and bridge for information and understanding. As a result, justice, equity, and collaborative effort have been her drivers for becoming a passionate servant leader. We also have with us Nicole Taylor. She's president and CEO of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Nicole brings together a rich background in Bay Area philanthropy, nonprofit administration, and fundraising with extensive experience in both the private and public sectors. Since taking the helm at the foundation, Nicole has led the organization to renew its focus on the many challenges facing residents of San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. She has championed efforts to increase local giving from Silicon Valley Community Foundation donors and also offers donors new avenues for working with the Community Foundation so that they can be more effective philanthropists. In the early months of the pandemic response, Nicole's foundation raised over $55 million to meet the needs of individuals, families, nonprofit organizations, small businesses, and education systems across 10 counties in the Bay Area. So I am just really delighted to have the three of you and really honored that you would say yes to this conversation today. Thank you so much again for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to pose a couple of polling questions for the audience. Everyone is welcome to respond to the questions that will come up on your screen now. They're coming. All right. So, I think these are the ending questions.
Those are actually the end questions, Tahani.
We'll put a different set up. And thank you.
And I can include them in the chat.
Thank you. All right. Well, we may not get our questions right now, and that's okay. That'll give us a little bit more time to be in conversation with each other. In 2020, we have experienced a global pandemic that continues to surge. We've also experienced an economic recession, school closures, wildfires, hurricanes, and a historic racial reckoning that includes ongoing national and international protests against police violence perpetuated towards Blacks in America. Also in 2020, in a year like no other, Americans voted and spoke on November 3rd and delivered us a new president and vice president. President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris received more than 80 million votes and counting. We translate this win as a need to squarely deal with our country's history of racial violence and oppression in every policy decision made moving forward. This applies to your leadership of foundations as well. Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have won, but the struggle for justice, equity, and change is still a huge challenge. And despite a record number of votes and record-breaking commitments to advance racial equity, success has been limited. My first question is to each of the three of you. What are the implications of the election results for philanthropy and movement toward more racially equitable grant making, both discretionary and non-discretionary grant making? So I will turn to Nicole and ask her to start the response and ask her to pass to the next person who will then pass to the third respondent.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for having me. It's great to see folks this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I think everybody knows 2020, as Keecha laid out in the opening, not just the elections. 2020 just shined a light on the 600 years of racism and inequity that this country was built upon, and the elections and the rhetoric around it and the divisiveness of our country just put it in just stark contrast to what probably many thought was a different kind of America we were living in. Some of us have been living in that America and dealing with what we saw in terms of those inequities, what we saw on the video footage of the police beatings and police murders, and tried to square it with, I'm sure we all did, with our day jobs. What does this mean for us? We are gonna have, we don't know what is going to happen with Congress. It could be split. That means federal aid and getting aid to our communities is still going to be a challenge. The issue around effective and transformational change at a federal national level is still going to be a challenge because we are dealing with a really divided country. And going back to normal didn't work for most people in this country. And I say that in the region that I'm in Silicon Valley, when people are talking about, let's go back to normal, let's rebuild Silicon Valley. I said Silicon Valley worked for 1% of everybody who lived here. Everyone else, it wasn't working. So let's not talk about rebuilding. Let's talk about what is a philanthropy, a philanthropic enabler, a philanthropic organization and leaders. What do we mean about building our communities? What do we want to build back towards? And for community foundations, many of us, it's not about our discretionary grant making. We give out about $13 to $14 million a year. That's it, in discretionary grant making. Our donors so far have given out $1.6 billion, right? So for us, it is, of course, our discretionary grant making will continue to have a lens of racial equity on it and deeper engagement and support for Black, Indigenous, and people of color leaders in our local communities. And we also have the responsibility to try to influence our donors' giving and help them understand what's really going on in our communities. And we have to leverage our partnerships with nonprofits, public sector, private sector, and be that convener, set the table where all voices can be part of moving our region forward. I honestly think, more so than ever in my career, that true change is going to come from the local levels. It is going to take us a long time to really get to a place where there's confidence in what can happen at the federal level. I think the trust there has been broken, and there's a lot of work to be done at the federal level, and the work is already starting. But if we're talking, our people in our communities don't have time to wait for what needs to happen at the federal level. We all need to really think about what's happening at the local community level. So for those of us who are community foundations and other community funders on this call, now more than ever is when we need to use our influence to really think about how do we build and support and invest locally. So for us, that's the path we're on, and that is both a short-term and a long-term game plan. So I think I'm going to turn it to John, so you can talk about the private foundation perspective.
Nicole, thank you. Thank you. Didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead. Awesome. And Keecha, thank you for inviting all of us here, and to your entire team at KHA. You have been really terrific partners. And in this crazy year of 2020, one thing I'll say is that this President's Forum has been a very important space for me and many others to come together to talk about the importance of racial equity, and to be able to be here with Nicole and Maria and all of you is a wonderful thing here at the end of this crazy year. You asked specifically about the election results. You know, obviously the implications for philanthropy go well beyond the election results from 2020. The results themselves are important in terms of shattering glass ceilings, putting a Black woman in the White House, woman of Indian descent in the White House. Those are crucial things. Obviously, more to be learned from Georgia in the weeks to come. But these are really just signs, I think, of the much needed transformational change in our society. And in philanthropy, I think we are definitely seeing some greater comfort in funding movements and movement organizers on the ground doing the work, mobilizing people and communities and local communities. As we've just heard, is so crucial to that. And philanthropy, I think, like the organizations and projects that we are increasingly supporting, need to organize ourselves and consolidate our collective resources to meet the moment. I think of the Democracy Frontlines Fund, with Keisha's also been deeply involved in, led by Crystal Haling at Libra Foundation, would be a good example, I think, of that. I'm MacArthur Foundation, and I'm delighted to see a bunch of MacArthur staff here on this gathering. We have a shared commitment to a BIPOC-led reimagining of what is possible, and which prioritizes the vision and the needs of those who have been marginalized for too long in America and around the world. And so just as we've heard in the case of Nicole's organization, we are putting racial and ethnic equity at the center of our work. We do this through something we call the Just Imperative. I think many organizations have similar broad commitments, but I do see a deepening in this year to that sort of grant making. And finally, I would call out trust-based philanthropy as an important part of that. As I noted, the having more of a hopefully increasingly faith in those who are closer to communities and closer to the issues that we're seeking to reimagine. And as Nicole said, we're not seeking to build a lousy past back again. We're seeking to imagine something better. And for us to do that in a way that trusts our key partners, figuring out how to do that well as philanthropy, I think that's a really, really important development of this year. And in some ways, I trace that as an election result. So really thinking about how we can imagine a better future, and to do that using the various tools that we have. I'm sure we'll get into the full range of tools that we have as philanthropies And the only thing I would add from MacArthur's perspective, just as we're distinct from Nicole's organization in terms of being a legacy foundation that gives away funds rather than a community foundation that aggregates them, is that we are an international funder. We continue to see America's place in the world as being very important, and particularly our grant making in Mexico, in Nigeria, in India as being an important part of that, and connected really to the commitments that we have locally in Chicago and at a national level in the United States. So I do hope that the election will be something that prompts us to change our ways as philanthropies and also change our ways as Americans and the way that we intersect. We can always improve the way we do that on a global level. So looking forward to that as well. And to my fellow Chicagoan, Maria, let me please popcorn it over.
Thanks, John. And thank you, Keecha, and your team for bringing us together, and Marcus at GEO for co-hosting this important conversation. So, as I reflect on this and the implications of the election results for philanthropy and moving toward a more racially equitable grant making, thinking about this, what we've seen this year, and certainly with the election, is that there is a stark division in this country. And yes, there is optimism and hope with the new administration and the momentum of movements towards racial justice. But the new administration will have much to reverse. We've got to dismantle and address. For the past 4 years have been devastating for BIPOC communities, immigrant communities. There are policies that affect the nonprofit sector, such as the 2017 tax law that limits the charitable deductions that Americans can receive with donations, and the looming state budget constraints in various states across the country that threaten revenue streams, such as in our state here in Illinois. So philanthropy can bring people together, and philanthropy can be a partner in addressing some of these issues. We certainly, as we think about creating the spaces to demonstrate our common humanity, and let's begin there. One of the things that we've done recently at the Health and Communities Foundation is really looking at, well, how do we even begin to speak about race and these divisions within our communities, and beginning with our grantee partners. Just recently, we brought 100 health leaders from our grantee partner organizations to attend last month's Facing Race conference, and created a space on the conference about to discuss, right? This was a space to begin with about racial equity and healing the region. The Health and Communities Foundation, we're located in the Chicago region, as John mentioned, both suburban as well as city, and many times there are communities that have been changing recently, but the space to discuss these divisions, or the space to discuss language is important. We need to fund community voices that are not typically heard, to share factual, on-the-ground information about the issues that they face. Many times communities have the answer. They've got the answer to their own, and perhaps we, as John spoke about trust philanthropy, let's begin with trusting our communities and their ideas and suggestions and their answers to these problems. We should also leverage our power dynamics in this moment. We've got philanthropy has power, and certainly one of the powers is our corpuses, but we also have the power to influence and to move. And that, as Nicole mentioned earlier, it does begin on the ground. And so I think philanthropy has that power to bring together, to convene and influence, but listen, and that bringing those voices together.
All right, well, thanks so much to the three of you for kicking us off with some really powerful reflections on what the opportunity set is. Your comments around new leadership, deep listening, and trust, and really leveraging your power and philanthropy showing up differently in these times is certainly a welcome opportunity, and we're starting to see some of that modeled by organizations like your own, and are hoping to see more of that as time goes by. My next question for you is about the possibility of a split Congress. Nicole talked about that a bit in her opening comments. How should funders think about the tension between transformational change and incremental bipartisan action? And then also for you as funders, how can you support the transformation change called for by our time? So I'm going to start this time with Maria, and then we'll do the same. Maria, if you could pass to your next co-panelists to address these questions.
Great, thanks. Wow, well, this whole possibility of the split Congress and how we should respond. Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that philanthropy cannot solve all the gaps that government does not address. We can't do it, even if we poured all philanthropy together, we just cannot. We can't be involved in legislation. Specifically, we're not a public foundation. The Health Communities Foundation is a private foundation, and so we ourselves can't be involved in legislation as other private foundations, but we can work closely with partners about what they need for transformational change. And also, however, this moment does call foundations to reflect upon what more can we do, both in the short term and long term, including on grant making, increased giving, digging deeper into our endowments. This is the moment, this is the rainy day has come, it's pouring. Renewing our grants from a multi-year funding perspective and making things much easier from that perspective. And certainly general operating from that grant making perspective. So I mentioned under grant making, those three pieces. From a grant process, certainly streamlining applications. We've been expediting disbursement process and listening to community. Those are some of the pieces that we have done, and philanthropy can do. We want to, and it's also something that we should take on forward, and not just during this moment of time of needing to rapidly respond. I think we're learning from this moment in time and how philanthropy could do better in responding and getting resources out. We certainly want to create long-term change, and it must, again, I keep thinking about this, it must be at the hyper local level with the understanding of the root systems that have created inequities. So we know that we've got to address the root systems that created the inequities, but we have to bring in the hyper-local lens. And if anything, this pandemic has shown us going back to trust, and not just from trust philanthropy, but trusting the message is important. Philanthropy must prioritize in building that trust, as I mentioned, and the relationships with communities and community-based organizations that are doing that work by supporting and listening and knowing what our communities need to thrive. And because we certainly cannot prescribe those solutions, I can't say that enough, and engaging that from, as John mentioned, in that trust philanthropy. So I would say that along with that, one of the roles that we can play is being willing to share our data and encourage data so that we can move towards transparency. So what are we funding? Why are we funding what it is? Be as transparent as we can in this moment in time, but also as we look at the data, understanding how grant making is distributed in our communities. One of the projects, and I know that John is involved at MacArthur as well, we're doing a mapping project in the Chicago area, looking at a cross-sector collaboration that created these Chicagoland maps of COVID's racialized impact due to decades of systemic racism and disinvestment in BIPOC communities. So it begins with being transparent and providing that data and sharing that. And with that, I will pass it over to John.
Maria, thank you. And you've said much of what I would have said in response to this, so I'll try to say a few different things. Keecha, the question about a divided Congress is one, of course, that makes us all think. I see my colleague Tara Magner on here, who described it as, are we more Bolshevik or more Menshevik in our approach, and that sometimes we need to take one approach more than the other, and of course we should think about all those things. I was in a session recently where I was listening to President Obama talk about his new book, And one thing he was asked about, working with Mitch McConnell and that kind of thing. The specific follow-up question was, how would you advise President Biden coming into this, President-elect Biden, getting excited for January 21st, obviously, but how would you advise the incoming president to think about this question that Keecha has posed? And he said, of course you need to reach across the aisle. Of course we have to find consensus where we can, but there's also a point at which consensus can't be reached and you just have to go do your thing. And I feel like that's, we have to, think about the issues that we're working on, not in a partisan way, but in a vision and mission oriented way. And if that can be done through collaboration with others who are reasonable, then great. If not, we have to go do our thing. And I feel like that's one way that I think about this divided moment. And when you think about what is our thing, I think part of that is also asking hard questions of ourselves and say, can we reconsider the way we've done things that we may have thought of as sacrosanct in the past? Are we really asking ourselves, how can we act differently against the backdrop of an historic moment to bring about a more just and equitable recovery to COVID with racial and ethnic equity at the core of what we do? And I really believe at MacArthur, we're asking that question of ourselves every day, not necessarily getting it right, but certainly it's our focus. I mentioned earlier the just imperative, which is seeking to make our systems and our societies more inclusive and equitable, and focusing both on what we do and how we do it. Maria touched on much of that. Make just a couple of specific examples how we're thinking about that in the context of MacArthur Foundation. We're probably best known around the world for the Fellows Program, which continues to be an important core of what we do. And in that work, I think our team does an amazing job of reaching out very, very broadly into communities to get nominations and people who are doing incredibly creative work, and also convening a group of selectors who actually really make the decisions around that. It is not a particularly staff-driven approach. It's one that has outside advisors really making those decisions. And if you choose those advisors well, who are connected to these systems, we will have real great change makers involved. And I really credit our Fellows Program for doing that over many decades. And we're seeking to do that really directly with current programs as they emerge. So we've historically been an arts and culture funder in Chicago, a pretty significant one. It's maybe $10 to $14 million a year, something on that order in Chicago. And historically, we've given to the organizations you might have thought an organization would have in say 1990 in downtown Chicago. But using the approach that Maria has described a minute ago, thinking about a heat map of Chicago and where the fund's going, and really thinking about this idea of participatory philanthropy, we flipped it to become a culture equity in the arts program. And as we do long-term, and they are long-term general operating support awards, we've convened a group of people outside the foundation who are in communities and close to the arts community, and they make the decisions for who gets these culture equity in the arts awards. And it is grounded in whether these are equitable organizations focused on equity in our city, and looking at that heat map of who gets it. Likewise, we'll talk more about this later. We agree with Maria that this is a time to spend more than we have in the past, and that means decapitalizing more from our endowment, which we're doing, but also we were one of the foundations that raised social bonds recently. As we're seeking to make those awards, we're doing so in partnership with a group of external advisors who are drawn from the communities that we're seeking to serve in this equitable recovery, and really deferring a lot of the decision rights to others in this way. And so I think there are a number of examples in which we can respond to this historic moment, and we want these things not just to be a flash in the pan, but rather something that's going to be continuing. And I think if we do forge this pathway with great clarity, that we'll be able to get a lot done, regardless of whether one party holds a lot of power or it's a divided Congress in Washington. But Nicole, I suspect you have some further insights, so let me pass it over to you.
Right. I'm going to just reiterate that I think real transformational change in this country must begin at the local level, as John said, regardless of whether we have one party in control of all three houses or if it's a split Congress. And there's going to be the battles between the White House and Congress, as has played out in the past. Our communities are where the change needs to happen the most. And we are going to be forging on using our public policy muscle. We actually, because we're community philanthropy, we do engage in legislative action, and we do connect with local officials as well as our Washington delegation on a regular basis to really ensure that we're bringing our community's needs front and center, and we'll continue to do that. And the one key piece that we have done, oh gosh, I'm losing track of time. This is now December, so probably if the early or in the fall, is we launched a community advisory council. I wanted to have the voices of community leaders and BIPOC leaders specifically engaging with the foundation and with not only our grant making, but the public policy work that we want to do, and understanding where the needs are in our community so we can bring that forth to our donors. The individuals whose funds, who've entrusted their philanthropic dollars with us, and also the companies that we work with. And again, it is that those real voices telling us what's needed, what's working, what's not working, where the resources are, what incredible assets we have in our communities, and how do we build on them, scale them, invest in them. That to me, it's that kind of ground game. And I'm going to beat that drum because that is the kind of ground game that we're going to continue to have to do while whatever needs to happen at the federal level happens. And I'm glad some of you are playing at that level and have the ability to play at that level. I can't leave the communities I live in and work for behind while focusing on that. So it's great that philanthropy is not a monolith, because we all play different roles in this, in what's happening. In terms of moving our country forward. And while those of you can actively and continuously act at the federal level, please do, so that those of us who are engaged and grounded in our communities can continue to operate, and that we continue to have these dialogues. I actually think that is how we get to transformational change, that we all understand the roles we can and should be playing. We use our voices, we use our financial resources, we use our power, as Maria says, and advocate for what's already working, what can be working, providing the risk capital in our communities when we can. But ultimately, because we can't be a substitute for effective government, we've got to figure out our role, and a role among all the sectors that can advance our the healing and the transformation we need to see.
All right, thanks so much for each of you speaking your truth about the realities of the context within which you lead your foundation, because I'm sure that what you're saying is resonating with different people on the line in different ways, and so this is a really rich conversation. And one of the things about philanthropy that it has the unique opportunity to do is to stage what government might be able to replicate. And during this time of racial reckoning, that is exquisitely important, because as Maria said, the rainy day has come. And so I want to ask each of you to spend 2 minutes responding to a two-part question that I'd like to pose. President-elect Biden called out systemic racism in his victory speech, yet our country remains divided on whether systemic racism actually exists. And for those who believe it exists, the question is how to address it. Does philanthropy, or to what extent does philanthropy have a role in the conversation on whether or not systemic racism exists? And how can philanthropic leaders use their power beyond grant making to influence other sectors? So I'll start with you, John, and then we can follow our same pattern. You can pass it along to the next speaker.
Keecha, thank you. I don't think it's a close call. Of course, systemic racism exists, structural racism exists. It has done so for 400 plus years, on this soil that we inhabit as Americans. It is an indelible part of our past and our present. Hopefully it'll be less of a part of our future, but it's not in question from my perspective as an intellectual or emotional matter. And I think to Nicole's point, we each have a role to play in dismantling it. And if you're the white man who's president of the United States, or you are the black woman who's the vice president of the United States, or you are whatever our role might be, we each have a distinctive and crucial role to play in that. And I hope that's true for 300 plus million Americans. I know it's not right now, but I hope that we can get to that place, because I think that would be a big deal. And in philanthropy, I think we each also have our own role to play. I'm a white man of great unearned privilege at the head of a historically white organization that made its money through the capitalist system, and we reckon with that past and that role. But I also think that is a position of strength from which we can help to dismantle systems that we are a part of. And I think that's the central opportunity that we have today in front of us, and I look forward to that. I think there's many ways that we can do that. And I hope that we can do it in a way that calls people in and brings people along. But again, if people disagree with that, we do have to go about our business and continue to do that dismantling day by day. I think that's internally within our organizations. I think that's in our grant making. I think it's in the way that we relate to communities. I think it's the way we relate to the COVID crisis that we're coming out of. It's just got to touch on everything that we do. And I could go on for many more than 2 minutes about it, but let me pause there and let's see. I can't remember if I pitched it to last. I think I pitched it to Nicole, so I pitched it to Maria this time.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks for this question, Keecha. As we think about, yes, absolutely, as John mentioned, systemic racism exists. I just recently had been reading Maria Hinojosa's book, Once I Was You, and the importance of looking at our history and looking back to the history of our nation, and so going back to these root causes that are being shown in broad daylight to all with this pandemic have existed for centuries, and beginning with moving out many of the indigenous peoples off their lands, and all the treaties that have been broken. But so as I think about that and reflect on this moment in time, COVID has been has been an opportunity, if you will, to really address systemic racism and to get to the root, because my health is connected to your health. If anything has come out of this, that has been revealed during this pandemic, and certainly foundations do have that power and privilege to use this at this moment in time, share it and build it in our communities for true transformational change. And while the Healthy Communities Foundation, our assets may be relatively smaller than others, but I feel that we look at it as our influence is and can continue to be immense. And so influence to us is just as important as our corpus. And for us, the influence begins with our community. It's certainly centered around convening funding peers, community partners, and certainly looking at addressing the needs of disinvested communities. I'll give you an example. So our foundation leveraged just recently over $4 million with $100,000 investment in a project. We invested $100,000, but we were able to leverage and bring in other partners in to address emergency assistance in our communities, in communities that have for many years not invested by philanthropy. So at a moment in time, brought in $4 million. When we looked at the issues related to COVID, we can, if we try to work alone in philanthropy, we're not going to make a difference or the impact that's needed. And that includes extending arms to our state, or extending our hand out to work with or pull in local elected officials to understand their civic priorities and educate them on the issues happening within our communities. Of not taking for granted that local policymakers know what is needed. And again, coming back with convening community voices. So those are some of the as I reflect on this question.
Uh-oh. Looks like she might have frozen. Oh. She warned us about it. You froze a little bit, Maria.
Oh, okay.
So we missed your last part.
Oh, you didn't get my last part. I had the answers to everything.
Good.
We all want it. We all want it.
Oh, no, basically it was just stating, and I don't know if I'm repeating myself here, but to those who might have heard or not, extending our hand, pulling in elected officials as well, local, as we're talking about this from the national level. I also think it's important to bring in at the local level, because many times we can't take for granted that they know what are the policies that are needed as policymakers, bringing community to the ground. Again, the perspective of philanthropy being conveners, but also influencing policy change. So with that, I could send it. Nicole, did you?
Yeah, sure, great. Thanks, Maria. So just to echo my colleagues, yes, absolutely, philanthropy needs to be part of the conversation about eradicating racism, first by acknowledging, as John started, that philanthropy is rooted in protecting systems of wealth, and systems of wealth have 600 years of history, excluding BIPOC communities. So just by the very nature that philanthropy exists, we need to acknowledge that it's tied to the oppression which created the wealth. So doing the hard work, we've got to look in the mirror, do the hard work while we're also working to deal with what it means in throughout our country. We also know that philanthropy redlining is pervasive. Less than 10% of total US philanthropic dollars fund people of color-led organizations. BIPOC organizations usually face greater challenges like operating with smaller revenues, reserves, and staff, and receive far fewer large and unrestricted grants, and receive far more scrutiny from funders about what they want to do with their funds than white-led organizations. Stanford Social Innovation Review reported that leaders of color face challenges in connecting with funders, like folks on this call this morning, gaining their trust because they have to enter and navigate primarily white networks and cultural spheres that they may not be part of, especially if they're running grassroots organizations or smaller organizations where they are just focused fully on the missions that they are about getting change to happen. So we need to just acknowledge it, and so that we can work on our own stuff, and again, not before, while we're also trying to figure out how to play the roles that we can in communities in our and throughout our country. I think I said this earlier, we need to think about our roles and how to break the cycle. How do we scale the model of aggregating capital and getting it out effectively and quickly? We have all proven that we could do that during COVID. Most foundations completely broke how they had been doing things with grant making, and amazingly, we're able to get hundreds of millions of dollars to the ground really quickly in ways that we never thought we could do before. So why would we want to go back to how it was before, right? When we showed that in crisis, we could step up and get the resources where they needed. We also showed that we could trust and invest the people who are leading these organizations on the ground, that communities of color were disproportionately and continue to be disproportionately affected by COVID and by what was happening with law enforcement. And we were able to trust and invest in them during 2020. So why should we go back to not trusting and not investing them in 2021 and beyond? So, this is our time to, again, looking internally at who we are as institutions. What do our new grant making guidelines really look like? What kind of support are we really giving? How are we bringing the voices of those BIPOC-led organizations into our decision making? My colleagues talked about examples that they're doing. I talked about the Community Advisory Council that we've set up. And it's not just to talk about our grant making. We want to talk about our policies and how we should be advocating, right? So these are things that we did. Philanthropy did some things really differently in 2020. So I don't understand why we would want to go back to how we used to do things. So that is what I'm going to put out as a challenge to all of us as you reflect on this year and start planning for, most of us are in the end of the line to get a vaccine when it comes out. We've proven that we can work remotely. We're not on the front lines. So if that's the case, you know, now is the time, seize this opportunity to really think, continue to think differently about how you have been doing your work. I know we are, and we are being unabashed about it. So that's all I'll say, because my colleagues, I think, covered quite a bit.
Thank you so much. I think the three of you have been just amazing in terms of sharing practices within your organizations, things that you're seeing in terms of trends in the field, giving us some anticipatory guidance. There were three things that I heard you say that really are compelling to me, and one is just being very, very honest about the extent to which the sector is rooted in protecting systems of wealth. The second being owning your own privilege, because each of us who is working in and near this sector has a certain amount of privilege that allows us to be able to occupy the trust that brings us in a place to be stewards of vast resources. And then the third thing is the power of influence. And so to that end, I have one question that I'd love to hear, just one final thought from each of you before we open up the conversation to those who've joined us today. We've seen great momentum from Grantmakers over the year towards becoming a more equitable and effective sector, and there's so much more work to do. What one practice, one point of advice would you offer to the sector for 2021? And I'm going to ask if you could keep your comments to 2 minutes so that we can begin to transition and open up the conversation to those who've joined us. So, Maria, why don't you start us out?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Keisha. Well, I know we've talked a little bit about sort of the process. So we've discussed process. I'd say two: process and bold grant making. And I'm not going to repeat the other ones I mentioned, but the one key piece of process is to achieve racial equity, both as an outcome and it's both an outcome and a process. We know that, right? In order to achieve it, it's an outcome and a process. And so while we're investing time in clarifying this and aligning, our shared language is really important with our grantee partners and audiences. So I would say, you know, being able to get that shared language and be bold grant making at this moment in time. It's not about what we can do, it's about what we must do. And our grant making is certainly needs to be guided by those community needs with the hyper local approach in order to address the health inequities. And being bold means dramatically increase our grant making. Our board, the Healthy Communities Foundation board, has challenged our team. It's maybe flipping from other foundations. It's been our foundation board saying, this is the moment to be bold. Let's be bold. And we've increased our grant making dramatically for 2020. We're looking at it for 3 years because our communities it's going to take years for them to recover from this. We saw what happened after the 2008 economic impact in our communities. They were just starting to recover. So addressing this long term. Thanks. So with that, I'll go to Nicole.
That one I'm glad you went first, Maria, because it gave me a little bit of time to think about what I would suggest to fellow funders. I'm going to couch it in what many of us who are leaders of color have been experiencing. I'm going to make an assumption that you are exhausted of people tapping you to learn from you, to hear from you, to get what you think, to bring you together, to, racism, equity, you're an expert, you must be an expert. Okay, so we're tired because we have been educating non-Black people our whole lives on what it's like to be Black in America and what we're living in, right? So are our grantees, right? So just as I push back on grown folks who you have the ability to learn, to educate themselves on what it means to try to dismantle racism, to be an anti-Black racist, to support BIPOC, just as you do that, please don't put the onus on your grantees to teach you what they're trying to get done. Don't always invite them into your conversations. You need to go to them. We need to be about respecting them and the work they do every day and showing up for them and not expecting them to continue to fit into our, square peg round hole system of getting resources to them. So I'm going to leave it there because that can mean many things to each of you. This has been an emotionally exhausting year for many of us who have to straddle and be a leader and bring resources to the very communities that we watch being murdered over and over and over again, right? And then still have to show up and lead our organizations and lead in our community. Our community leaders, the people you are investing in, feel the exact same way times 10 because they are on the front lines. So I just ask that as you move into 2021, that we don't forget that and that we wear more humility and go to them and be creative about what that means in a COVID world. But I think we all have the capacity to be that creative. That's all I'm going to say. On to you, John.
Thanks, Nicole. That's very powerful and should probably be our last word. But while we have many of our staff on the line here and staffs of different teams in our sector, let me just say thank you for the year that everybody has led. It's been extraordinarily hard. It's also been, as Nicole said, disproportionately felt. So particularly to those who have done double and triple and quadruple duty, thank you for that. And I hope that the break over the holidays is a restful one as we all charge into 2021 for everybody, but especially those who've done the extra work. You have our thanks. And in terms of others, Keecha, only one thing, it's totally unfair. I guess the one thing I'd say is leave no stone unturned in terms of our practices. And it's picking up a little on where Nicole ended in thinking about our grantees. I know that we spend a lot of time at MacArthur Foundation thinking about our grants management practice. As an example, we have an amazing grants management team. And we're thinking about lots of ways in which we could make the bar as low as possible in the best sense, not intellectual sense or not in terms of the quality of work, but in terms of interacting with us as an organization. And I know that sometimes means that our staff actually have to take something else on. We tried a bunch of things this year, allowing for verbal reports instead of written reports for our grantees. That was, I think, a helpful thing for some of our grantees. It added a little more work for some of our grants management staff, as an example. So we have to look at those balances, of course. I think that when we think about how we interact with grantees when they're renewing a general operating grant, could we have them produce no application, for instance? Could we actually develop a common application where people could, like in applying to college or applying to selective high school, you could provide just one thing to a lot of organizations. There are a bunch of things I think that in the practice of what we could do, we could affect systemic racism in an indirect way, perhaps, in some ways a direct way, and be helpful, I think, to some of the organizations that both Nicole and Maria mentioned sometimes have a harder time accessing the system than the large, historically white-led, historically white-serving organizations. So the leaving no stone unturned mean looking at our investments. Are we doing everything we can there? Impact investing in our grants management, in the way that we do due diligence on organizations through our legal department. I think all of that matters a ton, just as our grant making does. So thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much to the three of you. And I heard you say be bold, be more humble. And John, you're too polite to say it the way that I'm going to change your words to say don't be lazy. Show up differently. These are times that require that you look at all of your systems and interrogate your practices. And to the point of interrogation, or at least open dialogue, I do want to invite those of you who are here who've been listening and sharing comments in the chat box to please join us now in more of an open discussion. If you'd like to pose a question or to one of all of our panelists, please unmute yourself, and you're also welcome to do so in the chat box.
I have a question, if I could go ahead and ask it.
Absolutely.
So this is really for, I guess, all the foundations, but more for community foundations. There's a tension sort of in the field between servicing donors and servicing the community being affected. I'm curious, when you say you're spending more, we've had discussions around just our spending policy. which typically has been 5%. How do you make the argument for spending more for need, which is obvious, towards protecting donors' resources for the future in being able to service the community on a long-term basis?
I mean, I'll speak briefly to that. Thank you. So one of the things that I know you know, sir, is that most of the donors we have who have donor advised funds actually give far greater than 5% in any given year. And we have many donors who will give just about everything out and replenish. And then we have those who have saved a long time so that they could do and been building up their donor advised funds so that they have $5,000 in it and then they can give out. So, you know, we cover the spectrum. Because I sit where I sit in Silicon Valley, people think I only have billionaires as my donors. That is far from the truth. Most of the, you know, the median point of our donor advised funds is $83,000, right? Yes, I have the ultra wealthy, but not many of them. Most of my donors are regular folks who've worked and put money in, and they're giving it out, and they continue to give it out. And I think we as a community foundation field have done a poor job of communicating that. And I know for us, and I will just speak for my foundation in particular, people think that our super wealthy are just sitting on their assets. Sometimes I use a play on words when I say assets and sitting on their assets. So, but they've given out almost $2 billion this year. That's not sitting on assets, right? So what I'm trying to do is influence where they're giving. Right, and bring them the issues that are deep and the need that is deep in our communities, so that we can start doing more of the marriage, so we can start getting the resources targeted and where we know there's impact. And so that's just my perspective. If we did something where I expected all of my donors to give out a high proportion of their donor advised funds, many of them couldn't even give back or donate back in for many years. So
well,
then
I guess
the next COVID, right? So
I guess I'm not asking about the donor advised funds. I'm actually asking about the endowed assets that you have. Are you on 5%?
I have small number of I have $10 billion in assets. 300 million is endowed. So I have I have, you know, vast majority, almost 90% of my dollars are donor advised funds. That's why the influence is so important for us. So our spending rate's already higher than 5% and has been for a while because our endowment is so small compared to our other assets. So but there's other community foundation leaders on here who may be more like you, who have more endowment. I mean, you probably, you know, people are always surprised when I throw out those numbers because they assume the exact opposite for us. But there's other community foundation leaders.
I'd be interested in that too, because our foundation just made, and I understand not super supportive, but our investment committee chose to reduce slightly our payout on our endowment because of donor intent in preserving that when the need is great.
Yeah.
And so just that argument and that tension between serving donors and the people in need. And I'll end there because I've taken up enough.
Well, but I would ask the private foundations on this, who all are sitting on endowments, unlike those of us in community foundations that have a mix, right? Or community funds like Maria's. You know, this is a big tension, probably investment committees all over the country right now. Do you spend greater now and have you know, less purchasing power in the future when COVID, you know, 2023 strikes and we're here again? Or you know, so I think your question is actually relevant to probably everybody on this call.
Nicole, your point, absolutely, private foundations, at least the Healthy Communities Foundation being a private foundation that was developed from the sale of a hospital, so we're a health conversion foundation, and certainly addressing the health needs, but the social determinants of health that have been lifted through the pandemic. We've been having these conversations with our board and with our investment committee. And certainly, I think it means that being a good steward of these resources means being able to use those resources as they're needed. But it also, we need to make sure that if we found the silver bullet at this moment to address our mission right now by putting out our entire corpus, we would do that gladly. But being good stewards also means being able to be here for the community long term as we address recovery and the issues that our communities continue to face. So it's a balancing act. Our foundation, since our restart, has given beyond our 5% every year. And the conversations that we're having is not necessarily should be, the 5% is our base. And that on an ongoing basis, and truly looking at what are the needs of our communities and planning long-term to address that.
I agree. This is one of the biggest, sorry, Keecha, go ahead.
Go ahead, John. I was inviting you to.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in on you. I think this is one of the most important and enduring conversations we'll have coming out of 2020. And I think it is important that we think differently than we have in the past. I think one of the really simple-minded ways I've been thinking about this year is in 2020, things are not where we want them to be. And therefore the stuff we've done in the past hasn't worked well enough. So we need to try something different so that what we get in the future is more equitable, more inclusive, and so forth. And I think that relates to our spending guidelines as well as foundations. And I think the idea that we operate like a university or another endowment that basically says, no matter whether it's up or down, we spend 5%, I just think it's a terrible idea. And to the extent that our guidelines say that, I think we should examine them. And I know there are smoothing effects and 12-quarter rolling averages and 13-quarter rolling averages and so forth. But I think the idea that when things may be at their greatest in terms of need, and if our endowments are as low as possible, or low as they could be, we spend the least. I don't understand how that's possibly a good idea for us as philanthropies. So we have to think differently. What is the right answer? Is there a trade-off between spending today and spending tomorrow? Of course there is. Like arithmetic, is I don't know, as close as it gets to a law, right? There's some degree to which the math actually does hold up. But I think it's okay for us as a foundation to say, all right, if we spend more now, we will be a smaller foundation tomorrow. And we had that conversation between April and May at MacArthur Foundation. Our endowment had gone down 20%, 25% like everybody else. And we had conversations as a whole foundation and in smaller groups. And we said, if we spend more now, are we okay with being a smaller foundation, as Nicole said, in 2 or 3 years when, the next pandemic hits or whatever the issue is, or there's another, appropriate look at racial reckoning and so forth that pre-existed, but comes up. I think part of it is saying we're okay with spending more now, and we are, and then saying somebody else is going to step up and be bigger because more wealth will be created and other things will happen, and we're not quite as special as we think. And all that I think we have to be okay with. In MacArthur's case, we did two things. We let our spend rate go higher than the 5%, which is an important thing, and preserved our existing programs even as the endowment fell. And the second thing was we borrowed money, and I realize not every foundation has the ability to do that. But we borrowed money at 1.299% interest rate, $125 million that we're putting out. The debt service on that is not a lot of money relative to the social benefit of putting this out in this moment and putting it in the hands of many of the people that we've been talking about as benefiting from having the money, and whether that's Democracy Frontlines Fund or election integrity things that we worked on, or get out the vote in the context of this election, or many of the things we will do around an equitable recovery. I just feel very strongly that that's high value, high return social investment, and we should do it in these moments when it's right in front of us in this unique way. And we shouldn't be bound to, okay, our endowment went down, so we need to have our grant making go down, and then we'll be there for the next one.
Fantastic. Lots of passion and enthusiasm among the three of you. That I see lots of nodding heads, and I saw some thumbs ups and clapping among your peers who are here. I think we have time.
I have a question
to respond. Someone has a question, and I think this will be our opportunity to transition to Marcus closing us out. So,
yeah, I have a question.
One, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm in California, and my question is twofold, and it's about access and partnerships. If I'm taking a lens from the fraternity sorority approach, every fraternity or sorority, they have their own thing, they have their own philanthropy that they have, but they always come together, they support one another, and they go out and they do this work. In the mindset of where our young people are at today, and the crisis that they are facing, trying to cope and survive. I live in a community where there are African American led organizations who do not have that access to be able to receive the funding to support the work that they do. Yet and still, there are a few organizations that whenever there is a question, everyone goes to them. About 5 or 6 years ago, I would see funding opportunities, and they would communicate that they give to partnerships. And in this time where we have a lack of resources, and maybe funders don't have the same resources that they have, what is the thought process of having those opportunities be for organizations that thrive in partnerships, as well as including those organizations that do the work that may in the past have not had that voice or that opportunity? What are your thoughts on that motion? I'm in San Jose, California.
Okay. I think we have time for one of our panelists to respond to Winston's.
Yeah, I can actually, Winston, we can talk offline since you're right here, but I think Winston's comments probably are true in communities all over this country. So while we're working to break down what Winston's talking about, and we have grant making programs that we're doing specifically for smaller organizations that don't usually get the attention. So I can speak specifically to Winston's, situation here, but it would be good to hear, how folks are thinking about his question in other communities, because it is not just happening here in the Bay Area. We know it's happening everywhere.
Absolutely. And I think that this is what makes me so excited about this conversation, is seeing the comments that are popping up in the chat, and opportunity to talk squarely, and for Nicole to respond squarely to Winston's response. John saying, hey, we're dealing with the same thing here in Chicago, and we're a global funder. Marcus, I think this is an invitation for us to have more of these conversations. So let me turn it over to you before saying thank you to everyone. We want to honor your time. And say how much we really appreciate us having the opportunity to be in this discussion. And during this critical period for the nation's identity, philanthropy will continue to play a pivotal role. So let's talk more. Marcus.
Keisha, it's like you have my talking points in your notes. GEO, as many of you may know, is a community of funders committed to transforming philanthropic culture and practices. And we see this as central to how we connect our folks, to each other, to the resources that help us clarify and get down to the core of what it looks like for us to advance the kind of vision, the kind of common shared agendas that came through in this conversation. So Keisha, thank you and your team for partnering with us. You've been a partner long before this conversation, and this is just one, I think, expression at a really timely moment. But also thanks for Maria, Nicole, John, for just, I felt like at some point you threw away the script, and there was just so much heart, and there was so much experience coming through what you shared. Like this was more than just a set of speeches and presentations, as much as you being present in a way that represents the kind of collective genius and wisdom that may be required to move through this. And so I just want to reiterate what Keisha mentioned, is that it is absolutely our intention and has been over the last year, through the first year of my tenure, to really retool the way in which we come together through this platform of GEO. After 20 years of providing critical information, We are now shifting toward what does it look like to meaningfully implement the strategies and all of these amazing concepts that we've come to internalize. And so we represent a space that is welcoming for challenge, for really addressing the challenging and sometimes gritty and uncertain process of grappling with implementation. So when you can't go anywhere else, we invite you into this space. This is just one example of the kinds of partnerships where we bring in the expertise, we hear from people doing the work, and then we can draw from each other. And we believe that in doing so, learning a lot alongside each other, something is revealed that wasn't as clear before, and that represents a closer step toward a clearer picture of a shared vision. And we know without a vision, people perish. Perhaps that lack of clarity around the vision has led us to where we are today, but we can do something about that. So Keecha, I'll kick it back to you. And again, thank you so much. Thank each of you for being GO members as well. And this is just, I think, one little indicator, one little piece of evidence to suggest what else is possible if we can continue this type of conversation.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I think my colleague Sarah is going to round the conversation out and get us out right on time.
All right, thanks, Keisha and Marcus and everyone on the call. We just have 2 minutes. We are going to pull up a couple of polling questions that we will ask you to respond to. You should be seeing them in just a minute. And then I just wanted to mention that later today, you'll receive a link to an evaluation. So I implore you to please just take 2 minutes to complete that evaluation. It really helps us in developing this programming. And so there's a couple of the polls. You can just go ahead and respond to those. Do you think these discussions can be applied to your work and or to your organization? And did you find the practice of discussing what it would take for funders to shift practices in this current political emerging environment valuable? And then the third question is, let us know if you're interested in opportunities like these in the future. We will have our President's Forum programming 2021 schedule available a little bit later this year. And we really look forward to seeing you all again soon. And that concludes our session. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.